We have Bill Sundhu with us today. He's a well-known lawyer in Kamloops and past candidate for the Democratic Party. And he has 3 university degrees, including a master's degree in international human rights law from Oxford University. So welcome. And we have Bill here to talk about what's happening in the Ukraine with respect to the International Criminal Court and whether there's war crimes being committed, and if so, how do we get them to The Hague? So I'll ask you this question. Is the invasion of Ukraine by Vladimir Putin, is that considered a war crime?
So just to step back here,
Sure.
So there's often confusion between which courts we're dealing with. So there is a so-called quote unquote world court, the International Court of Justice. It's an organ of the United Nations. It makes decisions around border disputes, waterways, all kinds of things like that. And it has rendered a provisional judgment or measures in regard to a case before it. But there's little enforceability. The International Criminal Court that you referred to, I'm on the list of counsel, so I'm accredited to practice there, and I have had some involvements there. After the Nuremberg trial of the Nazis, or in the Far East of the Japanese war criminals, nothing much happened for 40 years due to the Cold War. Then we got Rwanda, Bosnia, things like that, and the world said, we've got to do something. So what was created was the first permanent International Criminal Court in The Hague. It became operational in 2002 when enough state parties signed on. And it is truly an independent court, independent of the United Nations and so forth. Now, there are complications around law, and I don't want to sound too much like a lawyer or get too legalistic, but the major powerful countries of the world, United States, Russia, China, India, are not state signatories to that treaty and that court. And that's a problem because they are the most powerful countries and they're not leading, particularly the United States, whom we look to for sort of being a leader in this field, but there's lots of problems there. Regarding Ukraine and Russia, so Russia is not a state party. The court has no authority over Russia. But
okay, one sec. So am I right to assume then in that case that because they're not a party to the court, they can't be brought to the court because they don't recognize it as a legitimate court?
Well, there's a way through it, through the statute, and that is Ukraine also is not a state party, but Ukraine exercised a unique provision in the treaty back to 2014 and 2015 when there was the Russian occupation of the Donbass region, for example. And Ukraine said, we file a declaration and we will accept authority of the court from 2014, 2015 forward. Okay. And based on that, because if crimes happen on the territory of a party that has filed a declaration like Ukraine, then it's wide open.
Okay.
And so the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has issued a statement saying, we've opened a file, we're going to investigate war crimes, crimes against humanity, and possibly genocide in relation to the Ukraine. There's a 4th crime that came into effect years later in the treaty, around 2017, 2018, the crime of aggression, almost similar to the crimes against peace that was used as a rationale to prosecute the Nazi war criminals. Mm-hmm. That is not something that Ukraine filed a declaration on, so that's not on the table. Now, war crimes, in my view, clearly there is sufficient basis to likely prosecute war crimes when we have attacks on things like schools, hospitals, civilian populations, deprivations of the necessities of life like medical care and so forth. Then I think it's very clear that war crimes, the elements of war crimes can be met. I'll just read what crimes against humanity also incorporates. So it incorporates deportations, attacks on civilian populations, and things like that. Whereas war crimes involved things like even severe environmental damage. We know that there was a bombing of a major pipeline. Now, if there's a huge degree of pollution and harm to public health, that's another basis. Using poisoned weapons, certain types of weapons, pillaging. We're hearing stories of Russian soldiers pillaging food and supply from civilians, things like that. Now, the International Criminal Court deals with not crimes per se against states, but individuals. And the reason for that is back in Nuremberg, the tribunal said, you know, the worst things that human beings do to each other, these crimes are not done by abstract entities, they're done by men. And so the International Criminal Court looks at leaders and leadership responsibilities, commanders of military, political leaders. And so it can open investigation. It can have secret indictments or open indictments. And then the issue is to apprehend those persons. That will always be a challenge. It's been a challenge for the court to arrest people since 2002. It doesn't have a police force. It doesn't have a military. So it relies on the cooperation of other parties. And so the question is, would somebody like Putin or Russian generals, if they were indicted, travel outside of the country? Clearly, they'd be isolated. Yeah. The world opinion would be adverse to them. And long-term down the road, one would have to contemplate if other Russians felt that that was continuing to harm their country, including the basis of the sanctions and isolation, whether they should turn these people over and have effectively kind of coup. So there's that second element that's always challenging. No different than our system where courts issue warrants for arrest, but you still got to catch the people and bring them to the courtroom.
Well, one of the most, I guess, the most famous person to be brought to trial, a politician for crimes, for war crimes, was Milosevic, right? Milosevic from the Yugoslavian War of the Civil War of the 90s. Now, how did he end up? He was in power. He ended up in a cell, and I think he died awaiting trial. I can't remember. How did he end up getting to The Hague?
So what had happened just prior to the creation of the International Criminal Court, what happened is, you know, the Iron Curtain had collapsed, the Soviet Empire had collapsed, there was more cooperation. And when we got Rwanda in Yugoslavia, they created one-offs, ad hoc tribunals. So they created the International Criminal Court for Rwanda, and that's in Arusha, Tanzania. I've been there. And then the other one was in The Hague, but for the Yugoslav tribunal. But then there was a momentum to saying, well, we can't just do ad hocs on individual situations. We need to create an independent permanent world court. And so then the International Criminal Court was created. I've been to the Yugoslav tribunal as well, and sat in part of a trial of a Yugoslav general. Milosevic, so therefore, was arrested and brought to the Yugoslav tribunal. He died in custody. Radovan Karadzic,
Serbian leader. I know for a long time, yes.
Yeah. So he was prosecuted successfully, and so have other Yugoslav offenders on all sides, Croat, Serbian, and Bosnian. Now, theoretically, the International Criminal Court could also be investigating Ukrainians if they committed war crimes or crimes against humanity, particularly even on their own territory. The court is independent, wants to be seen to be impartial, often says we will investigate both parties. So, for example, in the situation of Palestine, the court has issued a statement that it has an investigation, and it's investigating the Israeli Defense Forces and Palestinians. And the territorial jurisdiction it recognizes is not just Gaza and West Bank, but also East Jerusalem. And then there's the complicated legal question of whether Palestine's a state, but the court has got a preliminary judgment saying for the purposes of the investigation, it is prepared to accept that argument at this time, pending if there were prosecutions and adjudication of the issue, because in the General Assembly, there was an overwhelming vote to recognize Palestine as a state, but there's a complicated legal question.
Oh yeah, that's a long-standing, probably eternal debate. So when people are brought to, are convicted in international court, and they're sentenced, where are they held?
So what happens is, first of all, it's interesting, when I went to Oxford, we'd had 9/11, we had Air India, and having been a judge, I questioned whether the procedures that we use are adequate to catch these very sophisticated mass criminals that commit mass crimes. And that's the key thing for the International Criminal Court too. It looks at mass crimes, not smaller elements of crimes or smaller in number. So there's no death penalty. It's a life sentence, and it seeks the cooperation of other states to house them in prison. So countries like Belgium and Germany, or even the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has had people prosecuted from its state, then had them turned over on the clear representation that they will house them in a prison. And so it seeks the cooperation of other states, not just to arrest people, but in investigations, but also to imprison them. Thus far at the International Criminal Court, all of the successful prosecutions have been of Africans. There's some controversy around that because there's a criticism that there's a double standard, why not Westerners? But having said that, in fairness, many of those cases were in fact themselves referred to the court by the International Criminal Court. And then the court also has in its statute this principle of complementarity. What it says is you should prosecute these people in your own state. We can't prosecute everybody. There's too much volume, sadly. But if you are unable or unwilling, and then there's legal tests around that, we will do it. So the cases that have come to the Hague are from places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or from Sudan, Darfur, Central African Republic, Ivory Coast, the Lord's Resistance Army, Uganda, Kenya, where the court has felt you're not going to be able to do this fairly, or you don't have the capacity.
Right.
So you have assumed those cases. I would assume that in this case, if prosecutions were brought out of the Ukraine, they would likely end up at the Hague. Russia wouldn't be able to handle it. And then I think Ukraine might just sort of say, yeah, just for legitimacy, so that we're not accused of tainting and bias, we'll hand it to you.
That makes sense, because they'd be in a conflict because they're the victims, right?
Yeah.
So the if Putin's invading Ukraine on his own argument, and he doesn't care what people think about it, he's saying it's justified, and he's going to say, I haven't done a crime and I don't recognize the International Court of Crime if charges are brought. Or so obviously he's going to say, well, I don't agree with the mechanics of it, so do what you got to do. Can he be found guilty in absentia?
Well, I think that would be problematic. That hasn't been tried. That's an interesting argument. I would think the court would be reluctant to do that because, as an accused person, you have rights to a lawyer, legal aid, presumption of innocence, evidence not to be obtained by coercion. Now, a guy like him, likely none of those would be a problem for him. I would see real problems for that. I would think they would want him in the seat for the optics of it, for the demonstration of justice, having that human face in the courtroom, right? It's not demons that commit these with horns coming out of their heads. They're human beings that can look like our neighbor. Right. And so I would think they would want him there. That's an interesting question, though. It's never come up to my knowledge at the International Criminal Court.
Okay, so this the invasion of Ukraine, obviously the majority of the world's against it. They think it's a horrible thing. Putin argues that he's doing it to free them from Nazis, and we know there's been a stalemate between the NATO and Russia, going back to the elections of 2010, 14, and 19. All of them are democratically elected presidents of Ukraine. Yankovic left after the Maidan Revolution. There is talk of an involvement of the United States working and trying to install who they want there as not as a puppet government, but as a sympathetic president. We know the United States has a long history of meddling in other countries, of invading and of regime change, all the way from. So the question I would have is. I know the International Criminal Court wasn't around during this, but the United States, they invaded Grenada in 1983. Canada opposed that invasion. They invaded Panama in '89. They invaded Iraq in 2003, which is the big one we all remember. Why wouldn't those invasions be considered the same as what we're looking at with Putin in Ukraine? I know they didn't go in to take over the country. They went in to make sure that the government was friendly to them. And I don't think the mass destruction was the same, but they did invade nonetheless. So how are those different?
Well, that's because there's been huge gaps, and there was no International Criminal Court, and its jurisdiction only comes into play since
But if,
2002.
but if they did exist, would they look at those in the same way they're looking at Ukraine and Russia? Or
Yeah. So, there's been so many instances: Nicaragua, El Salvador,
yeah,
torture, murderers, on and on. Chile, the coup d'état. But let's look at Iraq and Afghanistan and I'll give the legal, and then of course we'll talk about the political, which is the
yeah.
real politic.
Mhm.
Iraq is not a partner to the International Criminal Court Treaty, so no jurisdiction, arguably, even on its territory. Afghanistan has acceded to the treaty of the International Criminal Court since 2003. It was subsequently, it said, we recognize it retroactively, and it's filed that with the International Criminal Court. And the International Criminal Court has said it has opened a file, an investigation to war crimes or crimes against humanity committed on the territory of Afghanistan by governmental forces, by independent actors, militias, warlords, and any other state actors. And so there is a very real argument to be made that for things like torture, which is a crime against humanity, war crimes, attacks against civilians, arbitrary disappearances, cruel and degrading treatment, that kind of thing. And war crimes too, a bombing of schools or hospitals or civilian centers, then it's open that anybody could be prosecuted. And, we have theorized in our discussions at times in amongst the international criminal law circle, what about people like Cheney? Rumsfeld has passed away, Wolfowitz. Theoretically, if you could find the evidence to say they were in charge, they made the orders, and I think there's an argument to be made there, then they could be indicted, likely for secret indictments, if they were traveling through a state party or cooperative party, the UK, Canada, France, Germany. You can see the political problems. They could be arrested and turned over to The Hague. Now, The Hague, in its treaty, says that state parties undertake to cooperate with the International Criminal Court. There's been problems. South Africa, Mohammed al-Bashir traveled to South Africa for African Unity Conference. The prosecutor there, the chief prosecutor, went to court to file an application over a weekend for a arrest warrant. Middle of the night, Bashir was on a plane and left, and the theory is that maybe the South African president tipped him, because those kind of things happen. See, there's politics. Historically, we've had state sovereignty, and the principle has been you don't interfere in the affairs of states. And the UN Charter talks about its primary purpose is the preservation of peace and security. That's the number one object. But with the creation of the International Criminal Court, that's when the world said, well, the movement towards, with all its flaws and some countries, powerful countries, not cooperating or signing on, is we want universal human rights that apply to all humanity. We've said after the Second World War, never again. Then we got Cambodia, Rwanda, Yugoslavia, no shortage of atrocities. We now have Myanmar. There's an investigation there. We want to send a message that if you commit these mass crimes that shock the conscience of humanity, there will not be impunity. We'll chase you down, apprehend you, and bring you before justice. And also the principle that justice and peace are interrelated. There can't be peace without justice. So you need both. And so there's that tension. And, there's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. But what we need is countries, and Canada has been a very leading country in the creation of the International Criminal Court. Civil society actors, media plays a huge role, universities, so forth, to continue the movement towards building these institutions and supporting them. It would go a long way if the United States signed on. The United States is not a signatory to most of the key human rights treaties globally, even the one on the rights of the child. It used to be only Somalia and the United States were holdouts. Now it's only the US. Donald Trump came in, and he even threatened to arrest the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court if she came to New York to address the UN. Very hostile, claiming to be I think saying he and his people are above the law. We'll do our thing. We're better than you. And that's just not a good message for human rights, but also it sends a message to thugs and dictators and authoritarians around the world. You can get away with it too. Mm-hmm. Look at the example being set.
Yeah. Okay. Well, one last thing I was going to ask you before we wrap it up, and this is just your thoughts, either as Bill Sundhu, resident of Kamloops, or Bill Sundhu, lawyer, or Bill Sundhu, possible politician. How do you see the whole thing in Ukraine ending up or going from here? Not how you want to see it, but what do you think is going to happen?
Well, I'm a lawyer, yeah, not a political scientist or a military expert. Everybody has their own opinion. I don't have a crystal ball, but it looks like, and I fear that Putin has cornered himself. He wasn't able to take over the country very quickly in a sweeping invasion. Looks like they're basically using a scorched earth policy. It could get a lot worse. I think NATO is right, despite all the pressure, and we're witnessing these horrific things with modern technology and social media and video cameras. Everybody has a camera in their pocket now. It's hurtful. It's shocking to the world, but we cannot risk a wider European or global conflict. This guy, there's an old story that when he was a boy, in his apartment, there was a rat in the corner, and he went to kill it, and he saw how the rat fought when he was cornered. I don't think this is propaganda. I think it's a true story. And it might be a bit of an insight into his personality, that he's under a lot of pressure and he will not want to be seen losing or backing down. So it could be very destructive for Ukraine. Ukrainians are demonstrating to the world their valiance, their courage, and I don't think he'll be able to occupy and control the country. He may feel there's a nominal victory with scorched earth, but he will not be able to control the country. And we know insurgencies are very hard to control, from Iraq to Afghanistan to so forth. He could bleed the Russian economy and their military long term. The Americans paid a huge price for that in Iraq. It's just a much richer country that can sustain it. But it cost trillions of dollars, the Iraqi and Afghanistan situation. Look where Afghanistan is today after 20 years, Taliban's back in power.
Square one, that's right. And I think that's what they say is that from the people I listen to, the pundits, the experts reading, they say it'll likely have to be, like you say, a prolonged invasion that bleeds the Russians to the point where there might be an internal coup or change or something, because they're tired of it. But we'll see what happens. Okay.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think that's likely it. We've got to count on the Russians themselves, the Russian leadership, the oligarchs, whoever they may be, military commanders, just like they used to do in the old Soviet era with the party secretary, is remove him and others around his circle. The Russian people are going to hurt as well. They are hurting already economically. They will be hurting in many other ways economically. And we know economic deprivation often drives political change. Right. So that's what we have to cross our fingers for and hope so.
All right. Excellent. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. I learned a lot here.
My pleasure. Take care.